Hey everyone, Miss GoElectric here. I'm in San Francisco where Ample has invited me to the unveiling of their next generation battery swapping technology. Now, before we do that, there is actually some action going on downstairs where the founders are mingling with a lot of media members and partners. But what are they going to unveil? We're about to find out.
Invited guests snacked on appetizers and sipped beverages while talking about battery swapping. This crowd knows that there are already thousands of battery swapping stations in China. The technology is so common that a third of the country's electric heavy-duty truck fleet already supports battery swapping. Tens of millions of swaps have been performed in China over the last few years, including passenger vehicles. After a brief reception, we took our seats in front of the latest Ample battery swapping station prototype. The station looked polished and can be installed anywhere in a few days with minimal permitting. The founders first outlined how battery swapping increases profitable uptime for fleet vehicles and how their modular battery technology can be applied to all kinds of vehicles from many manufacturers. Along with input from policy and automaker leadership, Ample made the case that battery swapping is a necessary ingredient for 100% EV adoption. I agree with them. The founders led a demonstration in which an Ample-equipped Kia Niro approached the latest generation of charging stations. The overhead door opened and the driver followed a screen prompt to get into position just like they would at a car wash. A module was swapped while they explained what was transpiring behind the scenes. The crowd was pleased and we all went home. Of course, I wanted to see more. I returned the next day so I could experience it myself from the driver's seat and talk directly with the founders. All right, so what happens is when you drive up, there's a communication process with the Ample compatible vehicles. It unlocks that garage door, it opens up, we drive up onto the platform, and then we wait to make sure the checks happen on this little screen over here on my left. They just adjusted so that the pieces are out to the wheels and it's ready to lift us up on the platform. Up, up, and away! Alright, we have reached the top of the platform. Now the robots are going to get to work taking out the module so that they can replace it with a fully charged one. Now this demonstration is just showcasing one module swap, and ultimately the co-founders have told me that the full pack swap would be able to be done within a 5-minute period. So keep in mind, a station like this is going to have 10 cars worth of batteries. This is hooked up to 100 kilowatts of power, which is fast enough to be able to recharge these modules as needed. Now I feel a little bit of action going on. It seems like they are putting that fully charged module back in the car. Those robots are getting out of place now. And now the platform is going back towards the ground. It's readjusting my wheels once again, so I'm good to drive off.
All right, now we're here with the co-founder of Ample, which is Khaled Hassounah. Nice to meet you, Khaled, and thanks for sitting down with us today.
Absolutely, happy to be here.
A lot of people might not know this, but Ample has actually been a development for almost a decade now, right? I want to kind of focus a little bit more on the story before you started Ample even, because you and your co-founder have worked together prior, and a lot of people might not know that your background is in a different sector, correct?
Correct. I was part of starting a number of companies, actually. I worked in networking, I worked in education, I worked in health, right before I jumped into renewable energy and EV battery technology. Yeah, and the last startup I started with my current co-founder, John, so we've been sitting in front of each other for 17 years, working across kind of two companies that took really a lot of our time and effort and thinking. It makes it a bit easier over time to work with someone who you know how to innovate together, you agree on a lot of things, and you just debate a lot what you're about to work on as opposed to kind of how you can be effective working together.
So you've worked a little bit in the healthcare industry, and that's mostly been stuff that is on the software technology side of things, correct?
Correct.
So how did you end up getting from that sector into the EV realm?
you can always approach a new space with fresh eyes. And that's been always kind of how we chose to approach technology, is that coming from the assumption that going into a new space gives you an advantage. Now, you have to be respectful to expertise. There's people who've been doing it for a long time. They know a lot. That doesn't mean you're going to come and tell them how to do things. But you also have an advantage. You can come and say, hey, maybe if we think about it slightly differently, we can come up with different answers and different approaches. And that's exactly what we did with health, and now what we're doing, hopefully, in energy delivery for electric cars.
And how is that partnership with your co-founder, John, work together to bring kind of the perfect mix? Because, again, this isn't the first time that you've started a company with him. So what makes it so great with you two working together to achieve what you want to achieve here at Ample?
I think we know how to disagree constructively, right? I mean, when you have rapport with someone, when you have respect from someone, when you know they're extremely capable, extremely smart, and when they know the same about you as well, hopefully, you can disagree. And you can focus not on the personalities and whether they respect you or not, but you can focus on the ideas themselves. And you can really start listening to them, they listen to you. And I think when you start doing that, when you start very comfortably disagreeing, you can bring that to your team as well, because other people come in and see it's okay to disagree. It's okay to not always be on the same page. That's how you really solve tough problems. So I think that's maybe the key, is just knowing how to disagree.
Was there some kind of point where you had inflection where you were like, okay, EVs is the right answer? How did that even come about?
I mean, we always knew EV is the right answer. I think there is no way in which you can move from fossil fuels without transitioning to EV. And one thing that's, I think a lot of people don't really recognize right away is EV itself is not the answer. It opens the door to the answer. Meaning, if we move to EV and we're burning coal in order to power these cars, then it doesn't answer the question. But what it does is opens the door for us to be able to make the transition. So now, if I'm working on electricity, I could get it from the sun, I could get it from the wind. So I think that to us, that realization of saying EV is just a transition point to allow us to get there, is where we believed that you have to make that transition to EV before you can move to renewable. The thing we start thinking about is first, how do you create infrastructure fast enough so you can make that transition? Because it's not enough to make cars EV if you can't charge them. And then second, how do you make it so that it is possible for you to make the transition to renewable faster? Because the last thing you want is to spend 15 years moving to EV and say, wait, the only way I can power this is with coal-powered plants.
Your background is more on the technology side, but you have already developed a team of about 200 people, right? So you're growing at a good clip here. But a lot of them also have background experience in the automotive business. How does that fit together with your side of the technology merging with a team that has that expertise in automotive?
One thing I think that we generally keep rediscovering as humans is that the more diversity there is, the better ideas will come up. So if you bring everybody from exactly the same background, exactly the same cultural background, technology background, professional background, you're probably going to come up with the same answers. You're not going to be able to innovate. And at Ample, I think diversity was very important to us. I remember kind of doing the math. When we were 50 people, we had 26 countries represented.
Wow.
Which is so wide that, you see what you try to do it across different functions. You want automotive experience. A lot of entrenched knowledge is important. It's very tough to build cars and car parts. It takes a lot of methodical thinking, but at the same time, you want to kind of pollinate that with technology thinking and with creative thinking. And so we just kind of try to make sure we don't veer too much in one direction or the other.
Online, I've read a lot about battery swapping technology and people who are detractors and say this is something that's never going to work. But we have seen that over in China, it has value there. Over 20 million swaps have already occurred already with one automaker that has been kind of leading the path with that. So what would you say to those who are not supporting the idea of battery swapping technology?
I mean, I would say two things. One of them is that something not having worked before doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It just means maybe the time wasn't right, the thinking has not evolved, or someone did not address the fundamental challenges that make it difficult to adopt. The prime example actually is Tesla. Mm-hmm. When Tesla came, people said, oh, we've tried electric before, it just doesn't work. And we know about all the big failures before. Doesn't mean Tesla was a bad idea or electric is a bad idea. It just needed someone to come and rethink a lot of the challenges that made it not work. And then once you're able to address these, then you open the door, it becomes possible. And the other thing is that most of the successful companies that you see that have done something really we think about today as innovative and big and very successful, we're not the first ones who do it, right? Like Google was not the first search engine, right? Tesla was not the first electric car. The iPad was not the first tablet, right? So in a way, if you think about it, success doesn't come from coming up with a brand new idea that no one ever thought about. It comes from actually methodically going through, understanding why did it not work and how can I fix that. So when it comes to battery swapping, I think if you look at Asia, it has been successful, as you said, right? Like I think we're starting to see it in our part of the world with NIO coming and bring it here. But if you look at China, there is a lot of cars, hundreds of thousands of cars that already swap. And it's been successful. I think we just needed to adjust the model so it works for our use case in US, in Europe, in Japan, where really you need to create infrastructure that works for everyone. You need it to be vehicle agnostic. You need it to be easy and fast and efficient to deploy. And if you address these, then probably will work. That's our bet, at least.
Sure. So do you think that might be the reason why we haven't had it adopted in the US market, or what's your take on that?
Correct. I mean, I think the way people have imagined battery swapping before required expensive equipment, required infrastructure that works specifically for one car model. It's very hard to make with other car models. It took a long time to deploy. So when there's a concerted effort and push in China to make electric happen, you can justify these things. I think in here it requires kind of a transfer of a modification of technology so it addresses these challenges, and then it becomes easier to deploy. It has to be fast, has to be cheap, it has to be convenient. If you address these, then I think it could be a big part of the answer. It doesn't have to be all the answer, a big part of the answer.
For sure. And to your point, I spend a lot of time in my career educating consumers and dealerships with automakers on adopting EVs and what you need to know. And a huge conversation on top of that is the home charging experience. And at this stage of the game, it kind of seems like most people, if you don't have access to convenient and affordable charging at home, then you probably shouldn't get an EV at this point. And this kind of might fill that gap for those people who might not necessarily have the ability to get those home charging stations. So can you talk about the deployment of this kind of unit in a major metropolitan type area?
Let me first kind of comment on something really, I'll tell you kind of something I hear very often, which is often people say everybody who buys an EV can charge at home, which is absolutely correct because those are the only people who can buy an EV. So in a way, kind of, it depends on how you look at the problem, right? And if we really want 100% to EV sold to be electric in 2035 or 2040 or whatever kind of the goal is in the geography we're focusing on, you're going to have to solve the problem for everyone. You can't say this works for this segment of the people. It has to work for everyone. Otherwise, you can't go and expect them to kind of earn more money from their vehicles or change the way they live their lives in a significant way that would be disruptive. And the goal of what we're doing is to make it so that you can deploy infrastructure very rapidly. I mean, you touched on the most important point, which is we talk about speed of energy delivery. That's important. You can't wait 45 minutes before you're dropping your kids off to school for your car to charge. You just have to be able to do it as fast as gas. It has to be inexpensive. But we really think the toughest problem to solve is how fast you can deploy that infrastructure. We can't wait for all human grids to be upgraded before we can move to electric. So you want to be able to deploy infrastructure quickly in a way that can work with the grid we have and hopefully get better when the grid gets better. And also that doesn't require a lot of real estate, doesn't require a lot of construction. So a lot of our focus with this station is saying, can you get it up and running in 2 weeks? That's what we did initially. And then we went to challenge ourselves. We said, can you do it in 3 days? And we can deploy the station in 3 days. And you think that's probably going to be the key component to being able to create infrastructure very quickly.
And you learned a lot because your first pilot program was with your first prototype, and that was deployed at about 12 locations, if I'm correct, within the Bay Area, and in partnership with Uber. And you learned quite a bit from that element to this element. And there's a lot of differences that we can obviously tell just by looking at it. And one is that real estate. So what is the difference versus what we have now in this type of station?
I mean, generally from one unit's real estate, it hasn't changed that much. The difference became when we wanted to expand. So when initially we were putting one station at a site and then realized there's a lot of demand, want to put 2 stations on site. And these stations didn't fit well with each other. We actually needed space between them, which means suddenly the space needed was not twice as much as is needed by one station, but maybe 2.5 times. And we started thinking, as you expand more and more, it becomes more difficult. So what we did here was we built it so that they can be stacked. So literally you can put a pod and put a platform, and then put a pod next to it on a platform. You start building and scaling horizontally. So when you build 2 stations, you need 2 stations worth of space as opposed to 2.5 or 3. So that's kind of one of the main features of this station, is being able to horizontally scale.
More modular, right?
100%.
And also a big difference between this was the way that the vehicle would raise up on a platform.
Typically what people do with swapping is, you think of it like a mechanic, right? Like you want to either raise the car from kind of the chassis points, or you raise it from the tires, which is great, efficient, works. The challenge with it is that you can't step out of your car while a swap is happening. And we started looking at the experience that the Uber drivers are taking and realized, wait, they do want to step out. They want to use a restroom or buy a snack or even just stretch their legs. And now there's this tough thing of like, you have to move before the swap happens. You can't go back into your car, grab your phone, and realize if you really want to scale this experience to be any consumer can use it, etc., you have to be able to just step out of your car while you're waiting for the 5 minutes. Why would you be captive in the car or have to do it before? So we rethought the platform, and we ensured that the whole platform goes up as opposed to just lifting the car. Literally, you can open your door and step out. And that means suddenly it becomes way more convenient. It sounds like a subtle thing, but if you're really building a product that you want millions of users to use, you're going to have to think of how people will interact with it, how easy it is, how natural, how convenient.
This in particular, it's also a little bit higher. So do you envision not only passenger cars being able to utilize this, but something maybe like a fleet vehicle that could
Absolutely.
roll into one of these units?
Yeah.
What's the limitation there?
Absolutely, like a big part of the focus. I mean, when we launched and partnered with Uber and want to deploy, we really knew passenger cars was the main use case. We could support different sizes of cars, but there was a certain range in which we could work with. And then when we started working with more OEMs, we started working with more fleet partners, we realized we need to support bigger trucks. We need to go up to class 3, at least in the cities. And then we need to also support tiny city cars, because that's a big use case inside the cities. And then we started debating a lot. Do we create 2 different versions of the station, but then that means you need to build twice as much infrastructure. You don't create efficiencies when you grow. And then we said, we have to solve the problem. So we stepped back and we said, how do you make the station work across all cars, exactly the same station? And exactly like a gas station experience. You don't have a gas station for trucks and a gas stations for small cars. You just go fill energy whenever you need it. So this station actually can adjust to match the car that is going to come into it. And the height is mostly to support kind of higher box trucks that are going to come in. As you can see, you don't need a lot of space above this car to support it, but then this gives you the flexibility of supporting all kinds of sizes and shapes of cars.
So what is the weight limitation on something like that?
So right now we support up to 5-ton cars. We're soon going to support 7.5-ton, which actually is pretty high for most city delivery. So we can go up to a class 3 pretty comfortably with it.
Now, it definitely makes sense to put these in those major metropolitan areas for the reasons that we talked about with the home charging kind of situation. But what about the deployment on highway corridors?
It's just as easy, right? I mean, the beauty, so you have kind of a challenge in highway corridors. Often you don't have enough power. So you have a challenge. Now, if you put this and you put a solar panels next to it, you can actually make it completely independent. So it gives you a lot more optionality for how you can create them in more remote areas. But it works the same way. We just need a piece of land and we just drop it. And then it's fully autonomous, remotely controlled and monitored, which means we can support highway just as well, or rural areas just as well as cities.
So is your plan right now to focus on those major metropolitan areas first and then kind of dabble a little bit more into those highway corridors?
100%. I think as an industry, we got it kind of backwards. We went and started deploying fast chargers along the highways when most of the use happens inside the cities. In part because it's easier to deploy along the highways, right?
Sure.
Land is exactly a lot of space, and it's very hard to get like 600 kilowatts in the middle of a city. So in a way, we kind of went for the low-hanging fruit. If you really want adoption, you need to be where people are, and that's the cities. So our focus is start with the cities, go to San Francisco, build kind of density. Go to LA, build density. Go Sacramento, build density. And then you put a few stations along the way, you cover all of California. So you start with metropolitan areas, you focus on where people really are, and then you give them the ability to expand from there.
Now, you touched on this a little bit where you're working with automotive OEM partners, and I read that you have 7 of them in the works about right now, and some of them have been announced, most recently Fisker Inc. And part of your relationship with them, as far as I understand it, is there will be an element of revenue sharing. So can you talk a little bit about that business model?
One of the things that we are trying to accomplish is to say when you build an EV, it shouldn't go bad when the battery goes bad. Because the lifetime of the vehicle that's designed to survive 10, 15 years is higher typically than the battery that goes into it. So that kind of mismatch of lifetime of battery and vehicle, the rest of the vehicle has been, I think part of the challenge with EV is that we still haven't appreciated it because we don't have that many EVs that are 10 years old, but soon we're going to start experiencing that. And you start to see it with the Nissan Leafs that go 40 miles on a charge. And you start seeing, I lost a lot of utility from a car that's perfectly fine from just because the battery went bad. And exactly, and the battery is expensive, replacing it becomes more expensive than the car itself, and you have that issue. So a lot of what our focus is to say the battery should survive for as long as there is utility from the vehicle. We're replacing it. When a battery goes bad, we take it out of the system, we put a new one in, and we continuously be able to have the car go for as long as we'd like it, even also as it changes hands from one user to the other, from owner to the other. So the challenge with that for the OEMs is that now they're selling less cars. And we said, well, let's solve that the other way. Instead of saying, sell more cars, create more carbon footprint because you're building more cars just because that helps you profitably, let's incentivize you in a different direction. Let's say we'll give you part of the revenue of the energy delivery. So this way it becomes a win-win situation. You make revenue from the lifetime of the car. You're incentivized to work with us to make the car actually survive longer. Hopefully we have significantly lower carbon footprint overall as we deliver these cars. So we just always thought, we've never thought of OEMs as customers. We don't sell them anything. We partner with them to sell to the actual customer who use the device. But we want to create alignment where we all kind of are more profitable, doing better if we achieve the goal we actually want to accomplish. So effectively, we want to be gas station for electric. If you drive 100 miles, you pay a certain amount. If you drive 1,000 miles, you pay a proportional amount. So in a way, it's kind of like gas. You drive more, you pay more. So it's very simple.
Now, your company is very unique because others who do battery swapping technology is by the full pack, but you are doing it at a module level, which is very interesting. So can you speak to that difference and what kind of the questions that automakers have in going that route to be able to, invest in having this type of option for their platforms?
One thing we make a lot easier for OEM in terms of adoption of battery swapping is that we don't need them to change the way they build the car. So typically when you think about battery swapping, you have to change how the battery attaches to the vehicle so that it's can easy to release. You have to figure out how these high current connectors can come in and out. I mean, there's a lot of technical difficulty that makes it very difficult to do swapping. And often you do need to make significant change to the architecture of the vehicle to support that. In our case, because we're modular, we build on what we call an adapter plate. I'm going to get a little bit technical, right? But we build what we call an adapter plate that has the same shape as what kind of the car was designed to work with. It has the same shape, same bolt pattern, same connector. That goes in the vehicle and never comes out. So this becomes part of the structure of the vehicle, provides structural rigidity and torsion rigidity, etc. And then our robotics know how to remove batteries from that adapter plate. So what that effectively means is that the OEMs don't need to re-architect their car. It's exactly the same vehicle. You just put either this part or that part, depending on whether you want a fixed battery or a swappable battery. So that makes it so much easier that from a technical perspective, simpler. We just need to focus on agreeing on a test plan, safety protocol, how the car talks to the battery, which is a lot simpler and easier challenge to solve.
So what have been the key points that automakers have been kind of talking about as far as resisting going in the direction of a battery swapping option? Because it seems to me that although you have 7, that's a good start, but what are those hurdles that they want to meet over, the reasons why they're like, I'm not sure if this is the right answer for us?
I mean, I think they're all practical things, right? But the first thing is that I think what we're proposing is different enough that people don't immediately realize kind of how much simpler it is and easier it is to integrate. So everybody comes into battery swapping because we've been talking about it for a while, assuming there is significant difference to how they do things. And I think the resistance comes from not wanting to look at it because like I'm not gonna go redesign my car. But the moment our conversation with them evolves beyond that, the moment they see what we're doing, typically that resistance fades away. It becomes, okay, well, is there a market? Is there a business? Does it make sense? And that's one thing that becomes a lot easier to prove. So often, most of our conversation around two things. Testing, and that's something we're pretty comfortable with. We've already integrated a number of vehicles. We've already proven we're reliable, sometimes even more reliable than original battery for various reasons. We have some advantages of our architecture that gives us an advantage. And you can agree the automotive industry is advanced enough in that when you introduce a vehicle, you can come up with a criteria by which you test a vehicle to prove it's safe enough to operate. So that's something, that's an engineering problem that can be solved. And the second is the business. And that's why when we started, we focused less on OEMs and more on the fleets to say, if the fleets need it, if it solves their fundamental challenges, then the OEMs will come along, and that effectively has happened. That's kind of our approach to the business and how we convince the OEMs to come with us here.
Yeah, and fleet is a really important part of the sector because a lot of that is based on the costs, and
Absolutely.
the bottom line is what
Extremely
matters.
sensitive.
Yes.
Right.
So what is kind of like the cost advantage of someone deciding to go in this direction? Is it just based on the manufacturing being more simple and them not having to provide those initial battery modules for their vehicles?
Absolutely. I mean, so from an OEM perspective, assuming that's the question you're asking, there is the advantage of I can now reach a much wider audience. I can still support the existing audience with my current architecture, my current battery, but I can reach another audience, the people who live and park in cities, fleets, as we're saying, without kind of significant changes to my design. But also the fact that because we have a technology that allows us to advance the battery chemistry continuously without really needing to make any modification of the vehicle. That's really the first innovation we've done. Then that means the car that I'm designing right now can go 250 miles, will go 280 miles and 320 miles a few years later. So I get the advantage of advancing battery technology without having to make any significant modification of the vehicle, which also ties into maybe the last big advantage, which is the localization. I think a lot of the governments around the world realizing this is a major shift in how we're building cars, and they're trying to figure out how do I make sure my local economy still benefits from this transition. And our ability to kind of build modules based on different chemistries and different locales also makes it easier for the OEMs to make that transition.
And that's kind of interesting because although you're a battery swapping company, you actually are producing the batteries. Is that correct? So are you doing that in partnership with someone, or are you guys sourcing the raw materials and putting these packed together yourself?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the reason we got into the battery business is because we realized you have to design the battery differently in order to enable what we're doing, which is the modularity of the swapping. And hence we kind of, I don't want to call it necessary evil. I think we did a lot of innovation, great things. Hopefully we advanced the industry, but in a way it just enabled kind of what we're doing. But our focus is on the way you package the cells. So we don't build cell technology ourselves. We have partners who supply us with cells. And that gives us the advantage of saying we're always going to use the cheapest, safest, most efficient cell from an energy and power density. So as the technology advances, we'll keep shifting to the cells that give us that, while we package them into a battery format that's easy to swap. So in a way, we're building more the modular battery and the battery pack, so to speak, while still being able to use someone else's cells based on the location or the features that it gives us.
Now, that brings me to another point where obviously there are a lot of federal incentives that are revolving around the EV business and battery technology. So in this case, are you able to get some of those incentives? Like there's a either $35 to $45 per kilowatt hour incentive from the federal government to produce these batteries. Are you able to collect on that?
We are. I mean, I think we'll need to make a shift to start using more local battery supply, especially on the cell, to make more and more use of the incentive. I think that was the intent of the incentive, and that's where it's directing the industry. So we'll need to do what everybody else is doing. But generally, it applies to us just like anyone else, both in terms of battery production and supply, but also from a technology and infrastructure deployment standpoint. Our swapping station technically qualify the same incentive that a fast charger or slow charger applies.
Okay, so that NEVI program, National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, that is starting to actually take hold this year and the next few years, had a lot of requirements as far as DC fast charging go and things like that. But you have also gotten some state incentives so that you could deploy some of these in California, is that correct?
Correct. I mean, the focus of the recent incentive from the CEC was around manufacturing of batteries in California. So we have our factory here in Northern California that's already making battery, Brisbane, correct? And we're expanding it because now we're working with more OEMs and we need to build the capacity and expand it. So we got kind of that $15 million grant from the CEC to help us in part fund that growth and that investment.
And what is kind of the scale of that, capacity that you'll be able to produce out of that factory?
I mean, that's actually, and that's part of the beauty of building smaller modular batteries is that you can automate a lot of the process and produce a large number of vehicles worth of batteries with really very little investment. So with that investment, our capacity will be about 30,000 cars a year of batteries produced at that factory, which if you look at the footprint, it's not typically what you'd expect to be able to produce from that level of investment, but also that level of footprint.
Now, let's talk a little bit more about the prototype that we have behind us, because like you're saying, these are modules that are stored in this station. So can you talk about how many of those modules are in a typical station like this?
We store on average about 10 cars worth of batteries in the station. Now, the reason I say on average is because, as we said earlier, if you have a smaller car, you have fewer modules, so the number of cars will be higher and vice versa for larger vehicles. But for a typical passenger car, you'll have about 10 cars worth of batteries in the station.
And we saw in the demonstration last night that the battery swapping is with one module at a time, and that process took about 5 minutes. So say a luxury SUV that has 130 kilowatt hour pack, or a fleet van or something of that nature that has a higher capacity, how long would that take for that full process to switch out to get to a 100% charge?
Sure. I mean, the goal of yesterday's demonstration is just showing the technology and how it works and the user experience and the interface. Which was just kind of to create an arrangement that gives you a good idea of how the technology works. The goal, this is the first prototype. The goal is that we're, based on what we learned here, we're updating a number of things and we're gonna increase the robustness and the speed so that by end of the year, we know the math, we know we're gonna get to 5 minutes for a passenger car. So if you have 10 modules, we'll swap in 5 minutes. I mean, one of the things you noticed yesterday, for example, the platform was going up fairly slowly. That was intentional. We wanted to ensure robustness with this model. So a few things will move faster, a few things will work more in parallel. But if the beauty of robotics is that you can predict exactly how long something is going to take and when the robots will work together. And with this, with the speeds of these motors, the speeds of these robots, with our sensing, we know we'll get to 5 minutes with a passenger car. So that's about 8 to 10 modules should be doable in 5 minutes. If you have a smaller car, it will be faster. If you have a larger truck, it will be slower. But that's the average kind of overall.
I know this might change because the chemistry inside the batteries might evolve, but at this stage or for your first deployment by the end of the year, what is your expected time for these modules to get back to a full charge?
Typically 2 hours. If we have time, we'll take 3 hours because it extends the life of the battery. If one day we have a rush and tons of people want to get them out quickly, we'll do them in an hour. So we have the flexibility of doing it. Typically 2 to 3 hours is our rate. So every 2 to 3 hours, the same battery goes into the next car.
And what is the power requirement for a station like this?
It's a very good question. So to move the robots is very, very little. It's surprisingly little. It's so efficient. We need 2 to 3 kilowatts to move all of the robots, including lifting of the car. So it's just extremely energy efficient. Most of the power we bring into the station is charged batteries. So our sweet spot in terms of charging kind of power is 100 kilowatts. The reason we chose that number, we're actually limited by that. Like we can swap batteries a lot faster if we have more power, but our approach is to say, what's the number that you typically find in a city where you don't need grid upgrades, you don't need to expect a lot from the utility. So we can go into a building like this and typically find 100 kilowatt of excess capacity to just plug it into the station. So that gives us kind of that, it's low enough that we can typically find many places without major upgrades, but it's high enough that allows us to get good utility out of this station. If in a site we have the power and we have that many drivers coming in to swap, we just put 2 of them. So we're much rather kind of increase our swapping capacity than increase our power capacity per station.
So it seems to me 100 kilowatts, you could potentially have people coming in and out of the station in an infinite loop, because by the time they replace the modules in the car, in the first car, ultimately, by the time they get through that line, those other modules will be charged enough for it to kind of create an infinite loop. And I think a lot of people might think they have to sit here and wait.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's the idea, is that because you have buffering, because you have batteries, and you can control how fast or slow you charge them, you just have the right amount of power coming in so that you can adjust and always be able to either make more batteries available faster or fewer batteries if you want to preserve them. And the idea is to make sure you can deal with these kind of increases and decreases in demand and still, as you said, always be able to have people come in and get a swap.
You have this battery technology that is for battery swapping stations like this, but do you have other plans to use those modules in different elements of the business and branch out a little bit more?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, one of the things actually we're most excited about, it's going to take us a few years to get there because then we need batteries that are depleted, is these batteries are so easy to take, plug into a wall and become second static storage effectively, right? And that allows us to almost immediately use them. If you have 1 million cars on the road and you want to go collect all of these batteries so you can use them in a second life application, it's really expensive, and a big part of the cost is that. In our case, we just go pick them up from a station. So in a way, it gives us an immediate ability to use these effectively, including kind of what everybody's starting to think about of the circular economy. Then after second life, I can take them, recycle them, get the metal out of them and put them in the next batteries, and then I need to do less mining, et cetera, et cetera. So that's probably the most important use case. We're also starting to talk to other modes of transportation about maybe a different way of swapping the batteries from these vehicles that are very different in nature, but still the same modular module. So once you have a module, think Lego, how many things you can build with a Lego block, right? Like almost an infinite amount of things. Maybe here not infinite, but it's really a lot more than we typically.
And you're probably collecting a lot of data on these vehicles and the batteries. So do you see a path to monetizing that type of incoming information?
Absolutely, absolutely. Listen, monetization is possible. The part I get excited about is understanding better, optimizing better, creating better, and we really have details about each and every cell in any of our batteries, including how they function across different driving behaviors and patterns and weathers, etc. And all of the data, because we almost have a connection to the cloud, is always collected and available. So for us, what we're first and foremost excited about is understanding how do you get more out of a battery across all of these use cases and be able to compare an apples to apples across use cases. So that's first. There'll be a monetization aspect. We're already in discussions, but for us, that's not really the most exciting part. It's really the learning from it.
Sure. Now, I really hope that I get an opportunity to sit with you again in 5 years to see what kind of progress you have made. But in that case, in 5 years, where do you see the trajectory of Ample at that point, and what are those things that you expect to accomplish at that point?
The challenge with answering that question is I assumes we all know the future. I think we're figuring.
We have a glass ball in front of us, right?
Exactly. A lot of people claim they do, but I think really what's happening is we're learning as we go. We're trying to understand. But there are a few things I know, right? Which is we'll make this even easier to deploy faster. We'll be supported by a lot wider use cases and wider kinds of cars. We'll learn how to get them out quickly. So my hope, or our hope as a team here, is that we make it easier for people to make the transition. We want it to be really, really simple. You should not think twice about buying an electric car or a gas car. It should be exactly the same thing. You just know one is a lot better for us as humans. That should be kind of the transition. And what that means, if we do that, is that we can hopefully deploy a lot more of them. They can be ubiquitous and available for anyone to use across use cases. Is it going to look exactly like this? One thing I know is most definitely not. Like when we built the first one, we thought we're done. And we said, wait, there's a lot can be done different. And we did it, and I think we're going to keep doing that again and again. But the idea of being able to move energy physically has worked for us for 100 years, I think, with gas. I think we can make it work with electricity and hopefully make it a lot easier for people to make the transition.
For sure. Well, thank you for spending time with us today, Khaled, and I really appreciate it. This was very interesting to find out more about Ample and where your beginning it really started.
It's my view that anyone with access to affordable and convenient charging will be happy with an electric vehicle for the time being. While most Americans with EVs can charge at home while they sleep, there are millions of US drivers who cannot install a charging station at home. If those drivers buy an EV, they'll regularly sit around in a parking lot and pay top dollar at public charging stations. Commonplace battery swapping would be a path to joyful EV ownership for drivers with that kind of living situation. Ample appears to have a clear path to serving commercial and livery fleets in major cities all around the world. Passenger vehicles and a nationwide network of swapping stations appear to be farther off on the horizon. I believe the technology can't come soon enough here in America.
And until next time, drive, fly, ride. Go electric.